get into the first segment of this show, which is going to be about sports betting, sports gambling, like players betting on sports, owners, all that kind of stuff. So it's well known throughout every single sport that you are not supposed to bet at all. Like, you can't bet on your team, you can't bet against your team, you can't bet for your team, you cannot bet, period. And obviously, though, like, while this is a rule that that is enforced by a lot of a lot of different sports, it's enforced by the NFL, it's enforced by the NBA, it's enforced by FIBA, it's enforced everywhere. There are players that often, like, they make burner accounts or they make, like, other type of betting accounts so that way they could still bet. And there's nothing, in hindsight, like, when you, like, there's nothing really wrong with that. Like, it's not like they're drinking and driving and you can immediately tell that, like, oh, they're drinking and driving because you can smell it in their breath. This is something that's very difficult to prove. Not only is it very difficult to prove, but it's also, there's nothing really wrong with it because you're not really hurting anyone other than either yourself if you lose, or you're just making more money for yourself if you end up winning. Now, it becomes a different story when you start betting on your team to lose. Like, that's where it becomes a different story, and that's where I think betting should be, like, that's the main reason why betting isn't enforced in a lot of leagues, because there's the speculation that a lot of these players are throwing some of these games just so they could earn a buck off of these sports gambling sites. And it's a little bit counterintuitive to me because, yes, the players aren't allowed to gamble. I understand why they're not allowed to gamble. But why advertise these gambling sites? Like, we see it everywhere, how all of these leagues are, like, sponsoring FanDuel, sponsoring DraftKings, sponsoring all these type of betting apps, and they continue to ban the players for using these betting apps. It's a little bit weird, and it gets especially weird when you look at certain players having specific deals with these sports betting apps. Like, for example, LeBron James, he has a deal with DraftKings. Now, why does he have a deal with DraftKings and isn't allowed to gamble? Beats me. No idea. But it's like, it's sort of like, that's sort of the gray area where a lot of people fall in. And it's like, at what point is it bad? And there's no real point to sort of like justify where the gambling is bad. That being said, however, let's talk about this particular instance that the NBA is investigating. So I have an article pulled up right here. NBA is investigating Toronto Raptors forward Jontay Porter due to multiple instances of betting irregularities in the recent month. So Porter was removed from the Raptors lineup ahead of their game against the Brooklyn Nets on Monday, and it's unclear how long he will be sidelined. And according to the report, the league is investigating two specific games where there was an increased betting interest on the under for several of Porter prop bets. So, first game took place on January 26 when the Raptors played against the Clippers. So, Porter only played 4 minutes in that game. And then he left due to an eye injury he sustained days earlier. Massive air quotes there on eye injury. And then Porter finished with no points, 3 rebounds, 1 assist, and did not attempt a 3, which allowed the under to hit on all 4 of those categories. So the under on Porter's 3-pointers was the biggest money winner for bettors on all of the NBA props that day for DraftKings, Sportsbook, according to ESPN. Then, on March 20th, when the Raptors played the Phoenix Suns, Porter played in just 3 minutes before he was ruled out due to an illness, and massive air quotes on illness yet again. He finished with 0 points, 2 rebounds, and 1 missed shot. And the under once again hit, obviously, on all of those categories, and his prop bets were, again, the top moneymaker for the night on NBA games through DraftKings Sportsbook per report. But is there a real way of saying that he was responsible for throwing these games or, like, influencing these bets? I'm not entirely sure because granted, the fact that that's even an under option it's like, obviously, it raises a lot of speculation, because if you are a bench warmer, chances are the under or the over isn't going to be able to hit as much. Again, like, I'm not entirely sure on the logistics of sports gambling. I am only 20 years old. I don't gamble. Let's just put it that way. But regardless, like, again, the over and the under hitting, it's not that easy to tell when a player is in the rotation. So if he's been in the rotation for several times, then hitting the under, it's not really that much of a surprise. I mean, if you are a casual NBA fan, you aren't going to know who Jontay Porter is. And chances are you don't know who he is. It's because he's not that good. And I'm just going to do this right now. I'm just going to look at Jontay Porter's average, his average stats. But chances are, if you're not a well-known player or a well-known role player, then you're not averaging very good numbers, and your numbers aren't going to be that good in terms of hitting the over and the under on a lot of things. So if I saw Jontay, I'm speaking from my personal perspective, if I saw Jontay Porter on the over and the under, I would go the under every single time with this guy. I'm sorry, but he's not a very well-known player. He averages 6 points. Well, he doesn't average 6 points, actually. He averages 4 points per game, 3 rebounds, 2 assists on 38% from the field. I am going to bet the under 9 times out of 10. I am literally going to bet the under almost every single time if I'm betting somebody like this. Now, the reason why this is put into speculation is because he decided to leave the game after 3 minutes of play. He was good to play, but then he leaves because of an eye injury, quotes, massive quotes there, and an illness, massive air quotes there, again, because it's that's all it says on the injury report, illness. And 9 times out of 10, when a player is down with an illness, they just don't want to play. And again, this is 9 times out of 10, and this is why the NBA is investigating these kind of things. But there were multiple betting accounts that tried to put large amounts on those specific under bets, upwards up to $10,000 or even $20,000. And on Porter's unders in the first game in question, while it depends on sportsbook, player prop bets are typically limited to $2,000 max per bet. So they literally, whoever was placing these bets, they tried to put their entire life savings on this man hitting the under, which obviously it's going to raise a bunch of speculation. And the punishment for this man, if the investigation goes as smoothly as I'm sure it will, I think they should just get rid of him for life. This, if it was proven that he was without a doubt trying to throw these games and influence the betting in his favor, because I wouldn't even be surprised if he decided to make his own account and put himself as the under, bet the under on his stats. I would not be surprised on that whatsoever. But regardless, if the investigation goes as smoothly as it should go, I think they should ban him for life, because these are the type of players that you don't want in the game. Because let's face it, leaving after 3 minutes when you were okay to play for literally no apparent reason, it does not make any sense. He averages 13 minutes per game, and then in this one game he's oh, I need to sit out because I'm sick. I'm not buying that whatsoever. And this has been a real problem in the sports world. What's bad gambling and what is good gambling? And this gambling problem, it's all started, I'll talk about NBA basketball in particular, but with Michael Jordan, we've all seen how Michael Jordan was so addicted to gambling, and, well, as the media would put it, he was addicted to gambling. The way I see it, I think Michael Jordan was just very, very competitive. If you watch the Last Dance documentary, he talks about it a little bit. He's very, very competitive, and when he gambles, he wants your money in his pocket. And that's the competitive aspect that Michael Jordan has always had. And it's what makes him like one of the most respected players in NBA history. And this problem, like, imagine if there was a thought in the 90s that Michael Jordan was actually betting on his own games, because that is always a thought. And I don't understand why it's always a thought whenever somebody talks about gambling. Like, there's always the thought that these players are betting against their own teams. And I find it very, very odd that they would accuse Michael of doing such an act, because he said it multiple times on interviews. Like, he does not like losing, and he does not like doing things that promote losing. When the Chicago Bulls, they had one of the worst records ever. They ended the season with like 29 wins, still made the playoffs. Jordan was against tanking, despite the fact that they wouldn't go far in the playoffs, and he knew they wouldn't go far in the playoffs. He was against tanking because it promoted a losing attitude. Talk like that, like, he says these type of things on an interview, and people immediately think, okay, he's gambling on the games. Like, really? And I don't really agree with that, because yes, I understand, like, there's always that thought process, but that thought process usually happens when people are coming off of the bench. They don't happen to Michael Jordan. And I don't think the gambling that Jordan was doing was really that bad, because it's like, he wasn't gambling on any of his games. So, in my personal opinion, when we're talking about sports gambling, like, there should be some context put into why they gambled, and why they specifically, like, did this, why they did that, this, that, and the other. Because we can go into several other sports. We can talk about football, how I believe it was Calvin Ridley, again, forgive me if I'm not spreading it right. I do basketball, not football, but one of the players on the Hawks ended up getting suspended for like about a year, I believe, for gambling. However, when you look at a player like Deshaun Watson and all the sexual assault allegations that were around him, he only gets suspended for like 10 weeks. And it's like, is gambling really that bad and really worse than sexual assault allegations? Like, that's sort of, I don't understand like the ridiculous punishments behind them if they weren't betting on either themselves or their own team. Like, if these players should be allowed to bet against other teams, and other teams that they're not even affiliated with, because again, like, I have to say they're not affiliated with them, because there's a possibility that other players might throw, and those other players might throw just because one of their friends on the league. Like, it's a whole debacle, and it's very difficult to like really prove, and very difficult to sort of understand, get a good grasp on what exactly the player was doing, the context behind the gambling, or if it's even the player, and if the player even has anything to do with the gambling, because there's a possibility that like some of these players that like they might use burner accounts, and they also might not use burner accounts, and they might be other people trying to impersonate them, because we have no idea. But I digress. It's a very, very difficult thing to prove. It's a very difficult thing to talk about, and it's very difficult figuring out a punishment for it, which is why I think that a lot of the leagues, they just vote to get rid of him for either a year or suspend him for indefinitely, and it just solves everyone else's problems, and it's a lot less work that these people have to do. And if you're a sports athlete, just don't gamble on the games. It's that simple. But again, like, I understand why some of these sports players, they like gambling and they do that kind of thing. But with that, we are out of time for the first segment. So tune in to the second segment, where I go ahead and I bring up some difficult decisions that a lot of teams are going to have to face in free agency. Now, you'll see exactly what I mean once you tune in after this short break.